All right, without further ado, let's talk about topics, your research questions, and thesis statements. Okay. Okay, so we're going to jump right in and start with choosing a topic. Okay, so a lot of times students come to me in the lab and they have a professor who just kind of said, you know, write 5 pages about something, and they give kind of a very general really general prompt as opposed to very specific instructions. And a lot of times when a professor gives you an open-ended assignment, or if you're coming into your capstone tends to be pretty open-ended as well, because they really want you to pursue your own research. Open-ended assignments where you have to choose your own topic are often more difficult than a constrained assignment where the professor tells you specifically what they want you to talk about. So it can be pretty daunting to choose a topic because it takes some practice to figure out the scope of the topic in how much space you have to write. Okay, so it's really important when you're choosing a topic to consider the length of the paper. You might remember last week I talked a lot about how length can inform how much detail you include in your writing. So, you know, if you only have 5 pages to write, you might need maybe a broader or narrower scope compared to if you were writing something that's 20 pages. So thinking about how much detail or how narrow your topic can be really depends on the length of the paper, the purpose. These all seem familiar, right? The audience, and then also your interest, okay? So if you are writing, especially when we're coming into capstones where you're writing something that is 30, 40, 50 pages, if you're going to be spending that much time on something, a semester or 2 semesters writing something, you better choose something that you're interested in, because even the most interesting topic, after 6 months of writing 30 pages, you're going to be tired of it, even the most interesting thing. So you definitely want to choose something that you're starting out with a lot of passion or at least interest, because if you remember from last week, I really try to highlight the emotional aspect of writing. You got to keep that motivation up. All right, so let's talk about narrowing your topic. Okay, so if your topic is too broad, if you have just, let's say you're in liberal studies and you want to write about the role of food in religious practices. Okay, just the role of food in religious practices, that's way too broad. There are so many foods in the world, and there are so many religions in the world. You could probably write a textbook or a textbook series on the role of food in religious practices. Okay, so if it's too broad, then you have way too much information, and it's really hard for you to make a choice as what's important to include. So if you narrow that topic down a little bit, it can help you realize, okay, this is a detail I want to include. This one is something that I can leave on the wayside. Okay. Like I said, if it's too broad, you can't integrate everything into one paper. It might be enough for a whole book, let alone one paper. So you might find yourself going off in unfocused directions. Okay. Also, if it's just general information, it's really hard for you to develop a theme or a framework. Generally, especially on capstones, you're probably doing something more in depth than just being informative. So my topic of, you know, food and religious practices is just kind of informing people things. You're just kind of repeating back facts. That is not really something that you would be arguing too much about. Now, there might be a way to turn that paper into an argument, although I think I might need some time to think about how to turn the food and religious practices into an argument. But it's better to have something that's narrow and easy to argue so that you can develop a theme, an argument, or a framework based on what you're talking about. Again, if it's too broad, it's hard for you to select methodology if you're doing your own primary research. Should I do a survey of 100 people? Should I do a case study of 2 or 3 people? If you have too broad of a topic, then it can be hard to decide how you should actually do your research. Okay. Now, it is possible for your topic to be too narrow. I think I've only seen that one time. In my 4 years in SES, being the writing lab director, I can really only think of one instance where a student had a topic that was too specific. So you can pretty safely assume that if you're having trouble with your topic, you probably need to go more specific rather than more broad. Okay. But for example, maybe I have a 20-page paper in which I have to, talk about these religious practices. If I only choose one food and I say the role of apples in religious practices, well, maybe there's only one religion that uses apples in a religious practice, and therefore, can I really write 20 pages about that? So it can be too narrow, but generally students tend to err on the side of making something too broad rather than too narrow. So when it comes to conceptualizing how to narrow your topic, there are several ways that you can kind of think about your topic to help yourself narrow it down. So one of those is aspect. Think of it actually as perspective, okay? Choose one lens through which to view the research problem or look at one just facet of it. So if you are, I know some of you might be taking ethics classes. Maybe your professor assigns you with an ethics problem and you decide, okay, I'm going to look at this through the lens of utilitarianism. Okay, so you have the problem and you're going to look at it through this utilitarianism lens. If you're not taking an ethics class right now, utilitarianism is often illustrated via the trolley problem. I'm not going to go into that, but it's essentially a perspective by which to view a problem, and that helps you to narrow the topic. Okay, you can also break your topic into its components. So with my food example, rather than saying all food in all religions, maybe I can narrow it down to just one type of food. How is meat, or even more specifically, how is beef maybe used in religious practices? Or I could look very specifically at a particular religion. How is food used in Hindu rituals? Things like that. So you can break food into its components, or you can break religions into their components and make it more specific that way. You can also make it more specific by deciding how you want to do your research. Okay, so the way you gather your information and the way you present it is going to be different if you're doing a survey of 100 people or you're doing a case study of 2 or 3 people, like I was saying before. That is going to change your topic and the way you talk about it as well. You can also think about how different perspectives or different variables or aspects of your topic relate to one another. Can you talk about the relationship of those things rather than just breaking them into their components? Okay. You can focus it in on type. This could include places. So, maybe food, how food is used in different religious practices in the Indonesian islands, something like that. Then you could really narrow it down by region. Instead, I said place here. And then also, as a general rule, the shorter the period of time of your study, the more narrow the focus. So again, with the food with religion, you could look at the whole history of a particular food and religion, maybe spanning 600 years or more. Or maybe something has happened that there's a new food that's being used, or a changed practice that has only happened in the last 20 or 50 years. So that's going to be in more narrow focus. So the shorter period of your study, the more narrow your focus is going to be. Okay. Narrowing a topic can be really hard to do by yourself. So when appropriate, this is where having a discussion can really help. I say when appropriate because sometimes professors would prefer that you not talk to fellow classmates or anything like that when you're narrowing a topic. So double check with your professor how they feel about you discussing. Generally, most professors are going to be comfortable with you meeting with a writing lab tutor to bounce some ideas around. That's something that we do quite often in the lab. And depending on the context and depending on the professor, you could also meet with your professor, especially if we're talking about a long research paper. Your professor, or if you have another advisor, might be able to help you bounce some ideas around as well. Okay. Are there any questions about narrowing topics? And you can type them in the chat if you do. I'm just going to pause for maybe 10 seconds and then I'll move on and we can have more questions at the end, but thought I would double check. All right, if you are typing, I'll probably see it in a few minutes. All right, let's move on to research questions. So this is a natural progression. You know, you decide your topic, you narrow the topic, and then you decide what questions you're going to answer. Writing research questions is really important because it really helps keep you focused. Because while you're researching, you can always be asking yourself, does this answer one of my research questions? Okay, so a research question really guides and focuses your research. You come back to it to double check that you're not going off onto tangents in your research. Okay, and a research question, when you're forming one, should be clear. Okay, it should be specific enough that your audience can understand what you're asking without additional explanation. If you need to write 3 paragraphs to explain your research question, it's probably not clear or specific enough. If you need 3 paragraphs to describe one research question, you could probably break that one research question into 2 or 3 smaller ones. And it's okay to have more than one research question when you're writing a paper. Okay. It should be focused. So similar to how your topic needs to be narrow enough, your research question needs to be focused and narrow enough that you can thoroughly answer that question in however much length you've been allowed by your professor. Okay. It should be concise. Again, we don't want to go off for paragraphs to ask one question. Ideally, your research question is 1 sentence, maybe 2 sentences to add to tack on a follow-up or something. Okay. It should be complex. Okay. So don't write any research questions that start with the word do or did, because those are yes or no questions, and I can answer it in 1 word. Okay. You want to write a question that starts with what we call our WH words. So what, where, why, how, okay? Especially the words like why or how, because those require more explanation than what or who. In general, there are ways to word questions using what or who that do require more explanation. But just thinking about how can I ask a question that requires more explanation than just a 1-word answer, whether that 1-word answer is yes or no, or a 1-word answer like a person's name. You need something that requires more explanation. Otherwise, it's not enough for you to write a paper about. Okay. Also, it needs to be arguable. Okay. You can't, don't write a paper, don't use a research question that's a simple fact. You know, why is the sky blue? Well, that is a why question. I did say write something that is not just answered with yes or no, but this is a well-known fact, you know, that blue light scatters across the sky, you know, things like that. It needs to be something that's arguable. Okay. Quick thing, I don't remember if I have it on my slide here, but if you can answer your research question with a Google search, with just one simple Google search, it's probably not complex enough to write a research paper about. Okay, so here's some sample research questions. So here's an unclear one. How should social networking sites address the harm they cause? Well, which social networking sites? What kind of harm are they causing, and how are they causing that harm? Okay, this is a really, really broad research question. Okay, you could probably write a whole textbook if we keep it this broad. So it's better to narrow it down and to something like, what action should social networking sites like Facebook and Twitter take to combat the spread of misinformation? So now we have a very clear idea of what the harm is that these social networking sites are doing and which specific networking sites we're talking about. And not only that, you're very clearly going to make something, this is clearly going to be an argument, because you are going to argue that Facebook and Twitter should take these specific actions. Okay, so it's a complex question because it's not something we can answer with 1 word, and it's not something we can answer with a Google search, and it's arguable because someone could disagree with you as well. Okay, here's an unfocused one. What is the effect on the environment from global warming? Okay, there are any number of effects on the environment. Again, this could be a textbook series, I'm sure. So you can make it more focused. What are some actions city planners can take to mitigate the effects of sea level rise and floods? So now we have a very specific research question. This is similar to the other one in terms of I'm calling for actions. A research question does not always need to be calling for an action from a particular person or body. That's just this happens to be these two questions. But who are we talking about? We're talking about city planners. So that's by its very nature going to be different than the federal government, for example. Okay. We're talking about mitigating effects. So not just what is the effect, but how can we mitigate that effect? And then what is the specific aspect of global warming that we're talking about? So we're talking about here sea level rise and flooding. Okay. Couple more sample research questions. How are doctors addressing diabetes in the US? This on first pass looks like it's a pretty good question. We have our doctors in here. We have a specific disease. We have the United States, but there still is maybe, we can still kind of answer it pretty simplistically, you know, prescribing insulin and suggesting lifestyle changes. We can answer that pretty simply, okay? Here's something that's more complex, okay? What main environmental, behavioral, and genetic factors predict whether Americans will develop diabetes? And we could break this into two questions. We could just put a question mark there and then have a follow-up question. And how can these commonalities be used to aid the medical community in prevention of the disease? See, the first question, like I said, I can answer in just a few words. I'm not making any recommendations. I'm just kind of spouting out some facts. Doctors prescribe insulin and lifestyle changes. And I'm sure there's other things that they can do for diabetes as well. It's a pretty simple, you know, 2-sentence answer, where the more complex one, we can see where there would be enough to write about in an entire paper. Okay. I already gave you, here's my rule of thumb. If a quick Google search can answer your research question, that it's not effective. So if we think about the diabetes one, I could just Google treatment for diabetes or managing diabetes, and my answer would probably be there in bold words read to me by Google. But the other one is more arguable, it's more complex, which means that you're going to have to do research and form your own thoughts in order to do the writing. And so therefore it's appropriately complex for your writing, as opposed to just something that is a fact or easily answerable by a quick Google search. All right, finally, we have thesis statements. So a thesis statement explains the main controlling idea of your entire paper in one sentence. And thesis statements do take quite a bit of practice, but basically, I don't remember if this is here. Yep, here it is. A thesis statement is the direct answer to your research question. Okay, so if we're thinking about, now I'm not in urban planning and I'm not a city planner, but the research question that was like, you know, what actions can city planners take to mitigate the effects of sea level rise? That's the question. The direct answer to that, your thesis, would be, in order to mitigate the effects of sea level rise on their cities, city planners can adjust you know, how close roads are to waterways, what type of paving goes on roads, what type of infrastructure, whether electricity is, electric lines are stored underground or above ground, you know, things like that. Obviously, that was not the strongest thesis because I'm saying it aloud, but hope you can see how it directly answers the research question in one sentence. Again, I'm not an urban planner, so I'm not sure actually how a city planner could mitigate these effects. But if you can narrow it down to 2 to 4 things, then answer your research question with that thesis statement and just answer it in one go, in one sentence. Okay. A thesis statement should also be concise and specific. So ideally 1 sentence. If you're writing something that's really long, then perhaps you could do 2 sentences for your thesis statement. But in general, it's possible to have a thesis statement that's just 1 sentence, okay? Again, it should be arguable, okay? So for example, the diabetes one, how do doctors help patients manage diabetes? well, that's not really something I can argue. That's just a fact. I can look up different treatments for diabetes. But if I'm looking at, how maybe are there different treatments that they can use, or there are different ways we can predict who gets diabetes? Are there policies that should be put in place to help with that? That's something you can argue. If someone can disagree with you, then it's arguable. Okay. A thesis statement should also be the roadmap to your paper. It gives your reader a hint about how your paper will be organized. So in my city planning example, if I talked about changing the paving of the roads, let's say I said, okay, we'll change the paving of the roads and we will change where our electrical grid is put. And I talk about paving roads first in my thesis statement, and then I talk about the electrical grid. Then in my paper, I should talk about paving first and electrical grid second. So your thesis statement should follow the same order as the rest of your paper so that your reader knows where you're going. Okay, a thesis statement is located usually near the beginning of your paper, traditionally at the end of the introduction. Although there may be times in perhaps a capstone where you give your background first, and then after that, maybe after several pages, maybe then you go into your introduction and give your actual thesis. But that's a little bit more rare for really long papers. It's more common that even for a capstone, it's more common that you have 2 or 3 paragraphs for your introduction, and at the end of that you have your thesis statement and then go into your background. That's the much more common structure. Okay, for shorter papers, it's usually paragraph 1 that your thesis statement goes into. Okay, like I said, for longer papers it could be paragraph 1 to 3 depending on how long your intro is. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of thesis statements. So the assignment is compare and contrast the reasons why the North and South fought the Civil War. So here's one possible thesis statement. The North and South fought the Civil War for many reasons, some similar and some different. I hope you can already tell by reading this that this is not very specific. It's also not very arguable, okay? Is anybody going to argue that the North and the South, Southern states fought for different reasons, and some of them, like, this is a fact. It's not really something you can argue. So here we have another one. Well, both sides fought the Civil War over the issue of slavery. The North fought for moral reasons, while the South fought to preserve its own institutions. This is something that someone could disagree with you about. Someone might disagree that the South fought to preserve its own institutions. You could also disagree that the North fought for moral reasons. The North maybe fought for its own institutions as well, okay? So someone could disagree with you or even accuse you of bias in terms of this thesis, which means you're going to have to prove yourself. And that means that it's an arguable thesis that you could talk about. So this is a pretty good thesis. Even better is, while both Northerners and Southerners believe they fought against tyranny and oppression, Northerners focused on the oppression of slaves, while Southerners defended their own right to self-government. This is a much clearer thesis. There was nothing particularly wrong with the first one. Let's look at all 3 again. The first one, definitely, the first out of 3 is definitely not specific enough. But between these, the second and the third one, these aren't bad. And the second one isn't bad. I think if you gave this one to your professor, they probably would be generally happy with that as a thesis statement. But a much stronger one is the third because it's so specific. Okay, like if we look at the second one, what are the moral reasons, right? Or what are the institutions that the South was fighting to preserve? Okay, the third one really specifically talks about that, what each of those are. And by reading this thesis statement, I can tell that I would probably, in my paper, in the body of my paper, I might start talking about tyranny and oppression. And then I would talk about the North and how the focus of the oppression of slaves. And then I would talk about the South and the right to self-government, because that's the order that it's written in my thesis. Okay, so your thesis should be a little mini research paper that is written in the same order as the rest of the body of your paper. Okay, So how do I write a thesis statement? You should consider the type of essay. Are you doing compare and contrast, cause effects? Okay. You can think about how you're going to word your thesis statement depending on that type of essay. And you can consider what your main idea and your supporting points are going to be. And those can generally be condensed into one paragraph, or not one paragraph, sorry, one sentence. Okay. And then consider how to directly answer your research question. Like I was saying before, you want the direct answer of how city planners can mitigate the effects of sea level rise and floods. Okay. So what makes a good thesis statement? It should be concise and specific. Okay. This one is concise. It's pretty short, but it's not very specific. It's pretty broad. Okay. Like I said, this one gets a little bit more specific. Okay, because we're talking specifically about the oppression of slaves and the right to self-government. Okay, a thesis statement should also be parallel. That's a grammatical term, and if you want, I can include a link in my email later today that's talking about parallel. But because a thesis statement typically includes a list of items, you know, city planners can mitigate the effects of climate change by doing A, B, and C. We have a list of 3 things. They need to be grammatically parallel. So here's an example of a sentence that's not parallel. Not understanding how other cultures communicate can lead to misunderstandings, miscommunication, and causing other problems. So causing other problems does not fit grammatically with the other 2 items in the list. Okay, so you could just say it can lead to other problems. Right, so that we have noun, misunderstandings, noun, miscommunication, noun, and then we can just end it with other problems, which is another noun, okay? And I can include a link to the Purdue online writing lab where they have an explanation of parallelism, okay? And here's a way to fix it, okay? A good thesis needs to be arguable. Okay, The Hunger Games is a science fiction adventure film based on the novel of the same name by Suzanne Collins. That's a fact. Nobody's going to argue with that. Okay, versus The Hunger Games is a morality tale about the dangers of a political system that is dominated by the wealthy. That's something that you're going to have to prove and explain. Okay. All right, so we are all finished. I said about 30 minutes, and that's 30 minutes basically on the dot. So if you have any questions about thesis statements or research questions or topics, narrowing your topic, you can type them in the chat or you can unmute yourself. If you got to run and eat your lunch before your next meeting, you're free to go. I'll send you this recording. And I'm going to stop the recording now so that if anybody wants to ask their question and not be recorded, you can feel free. So I'm stopping recording now.